The biting wind, a phantom claw, tore through the ragged trenches, whipping snow into a frenzy that blurred the skeletal trees and transformed the Ardennes Forest into a monochrome nightmare. December 16, 1944. For the men huddled in their frozen foxholes, it was just another brutal day in a war that had bled Europe dry. But for a handful of men, it was the precipice of oblivion. The eve of a gamble so audacious it bordered on madness. In a dimly lit, hastily constructed bunker near the front, the air hung thick with the acrid scent of stale cigar smoke and the metallic tang of fear. Colonel Hans Dietrich, his face a roadmap of sleepless nights and grim resolve, stared at the map spread across a scarred wooden table. The flickering lamplight cast dancing shadows that seemed to mock the precise lines and markings of military strategy. His gaze, usually sharp and piercing, was clouded with a gnawing unease. He ran a calloused thumb over the Ardennes, a region few had anticipated as the focal point of a major offensive. "The Americans are complacent," he rasped, his voice a low growl that struggled against the howl of the wind outside. "They believe the war is all but won. They've thinned their lines here, believing this frozen wilderness is impassable." He gestured with a blunt finger, tracing a path through the dense, snow-laden forests. "They are wrong." Beside him, Major Klaus Richter, younger but no less weary, nodded. His uniform was stiff with frost, his breath misting in the frigid air. "The Führer has authorized it, Colonel. Operation Wacht am Rhein, the Rhine Watch, a final, decisive blow." The words, meant to inspire, sounded hollow even to his own ears. He felt the immense weight of expectation, the desperate hope that this improbable thrust could shatter the Allied advance and force them back to the negotiating table. Dietrich grunted, a sound that conveyed a lifetime of doubt. "A blow, yes. But will it be decisive, or will it break us?" He leaned closer, his eyes glinting with a fierce, almost desperate conviction. "We have the tanks, Klaus. The new Panthers, the Tigers, more than they expect. We have the element of surprise, and we have the weather. This blizzard, it will blind their air power, cripple their reconnaissance. It will be our shield." He tapped a point on the map, a seemingly insignificant crossroads deep within the Ardennes. "Here. This is where we break through. We drive for Antwerp. Cut their supply lines. Sow chaos. Force them to retreat. To reconsider." The vision was intoxicating, a flicker of the glory days when German armies had swept across Europe. But the present reality was a stark and brutal contrast. Fuel was scarce, morale was fraying, and the relentless Allied bombing campaign had crippled industry. This was a desperate gamble, a throw of the dice from a nation teetering on the brink. "The men are ready, Colonel," Richter said, trying to inject a note of confidence into his voice. "They believe in this. They believe in you." He saw the flicker of pride in Dietrich's eyes, quickly extinguished by a familiar shadow of responsibility. "Belief is a fragile thing, Klaus," Dietrich said, his gaze drifting to the small, grimy window where the snow swirled like a vengeful spirit. "It is easily shattered by the roar of cannon and the sight of their dead." He turned back to the map, his fingers tracing the proposed route again. "We move under the cover of darkness and this storm. We use deception, false radio transmissions. We make them believe we are elsewhere, consolidating, regrouping." Across the continent, in a cramped, dimly lit office in Luxembourg, the air was a different kind of tense. Here, the chill was not solely from the winter air, but from the palpable weight of intelligence reports, fragmented and often contradictory. Captain Robert Davies, a lean, sharp-featured man with eyes that missed nothing, hunched over a stack of papers. His face, usually animated by a keen intellect, was etched with a deep concentration that bordered on obsession. He ran a hand through his already disheveled brown hair, the stubble on his chin a testament to days and nights spent poring over intercepted communications, aerial reconnaissance photos, and the whispers of informants. The Ardennes. It was a sector he had flagged as alarmingly quiet, a quiet that screamed of something brewing beneath the surface. "It doesn't make sense," he muttered to himself, his voice barely audible above the rhythmic drumming of his own fingers on the desk. He tapped a report detailing unusual troop movements, a sudden surge in fuel requisitions, and the rerouting of several panzer divisions. They're building up, but where? And why here? His superior, Major General Arthur Van Cleef, a man whose booming voice and jovial demeanor often masked a shrewd, strategic mind, entered the small office, his breath pluming in the cold. "Still at it, Davies. You'll freeze your brain in here." Davies looked up, his eyes alight with a restless energy. "General, I'm telling you, something is wrong. The intelligence we're receiving is incomplete. It's like they're trying to tell us something, but the message is garbled." He gestured to the map, his finger hovering over the Ardennes. "Look at this sector. It's been a quiet front for months. The Americans have redeployed their best units elsewhere, expecting a push through Alsace or the Rhineland." Van Cleef walked over, his gaze following Davies's finger. He recognized the familiar intensity in the young captain's eyes. Davies had a knack for seeing patterns where others saw only chaos, for piecing together the most obscure fragments of information into a coherent whole. "And you think they're planning something here, in this frozen backwater?" Van Cleef asked, his tone skeptical but not dismissive. He knew Davies's track record. He had a sixth sense for the enemy's intentions, a talent honed by years of painstaking analysis. "I do, sir," Davies said, his voice firm. "The troop concentrations are too significant for a mere defensive posture. The fuel requests are astronomical. And the weather? They're expecting this blizzard. They're counting on it to mask their movements and ground our air support." He picked up another report, his brow furrowed. "This intercepted radio traffic is particularly disturbing. It's fragmented, highly encrypted, but the recurring phrase, Wacht am Rhein, Rhein watch, it doesn't fit any known defensive operation." Van Cleef stroked his chin, his usual joviality replaced by a thoughtful frown. "Rhine watch. It sounds defensive, doesn't it? A watch on the Rhine." "Or a watch for something on the Rhine," Davies countered, his mind already racing ahead. "A prelude to an offensive that will reach the Rhine, and beyond." He leaned back, the weariness of his pursuit evident in the slump of his shoulders, but his eyes still burned with an unyielding determination. "General, I believe we are on the verge of a major German offensive, and if my instincts are correct, it's going to hit us here, where we least expect it." He met Van Cleef's gaze, his own filled with a desperate plea. "We need to redeploy. We need to reinforce this sector. Now." The wind howled outside, a prelude to the storm that was about to break, both on the battlefield and in the minds of men who were about to play their final, desperate hand. The fate of the war, and countless lives, hung precariously in the balance, a balance poised between the audacious gambits of a desperate enemy and the keen, unwavering gaze of a single intelligence officer. The wind howled a ragged dirge through the skeletal pines, a phantom claw scratching at the canvas of the tent. Inside, the air was thick with the acrid bite of stale cigar smoke and the nervous energy of men on the precipice of the unknown. Colonel Hans Dietrich traced a gloved finger across the worn map, the flickering lamplight casting dancing shadows that mimicked the gnawing uncertainty in his gut. Beside him, Major Klaus Richter, his face a roadmap of sleepless nights etched with a weariness that went beyond mere fatigue, watched the colonel's every move. The Führer's impatience was a palpable thing, a constant pressure radiating from distant, insulated headquarters, a stark contrast to the brutal reality of this frozen wilderness. "They expect us to be bogged down, Klaus," Dietrich rasped, his voice low and gravelly. "They see this snow, this God-forsaken terrain, and they think we are finished before we have even begun. They think us predictable." A grim smile, devoid of humor, touched his lips. "Let them think that. The Americans are complacent. They have grown fat on their victories, their air superiority, their comfortable rear echelons." He tapped a point on the map, a smudge of gray representing the Ardennes. "This is the weak point, the forgotten sector, the place they least expect us to bleed." Richter shifted, the worn wool of his uniform rustling. "And the weather, Colonel? It is a double-edged sword. It conceals us, yes, but it also cripples our own advance. Our panzers will struggle. Our supply lines will be stretched thinner than a desperate prayer." Dietrich's gaze was fixed, unyielding. "The storm is our shield, Klaus. It blinds their eyes in the sky, their precious fighter planes that have been our scourge for so long. Without air cover, they are vulnerable. And our armor, our Panthers and Tigers, they are built for this. They will carve a path through their defenses. This is not just an offensive. It is a gamble, a desperate throw of the dice. But it is a gamble we must take. The fatherland demands it." He paused, the silence amplifying the distant shriek of the wind. "The Führer believes this will shatter their will, break their alliance. He believes this will be the lightning strike to end the war." Richter nodded, though his eyes held a flicker of doubt that he couldn't entirely suppress. He had seen the dwindling resources, the increasingly hollow pronouncements from Berlin. He admired Dietrich's conviction, his steely resolve, but the sheer audacity of Wacht am Rhein felt like a desperate lunge into the abyss, fueled more by fervent hope than by cold, hard calculation. "The timing, Colonel? General von Rundstedt is confident in the initial thrust, but the follow-up? The follow-up depends on surprise, Klaus, on speed, on the confusion we sow. We hit them hard, fast, and deep. We exploit the chaos. We reach Antwerp, and the Allies are split in two, their supply lines severed, their morale broken. This is our last chance, our only chance." Dietrich straightened, his broad shoulders seeming to carry the weight of the entire Reich. "Prepare the men. The order will come with the morning light. We march into the snow, and we march towards victory. Or oblivion." Miles to the west, in a cramped, dimly lit office in Luxembourg that felt perpetually chilled, Captain Robert Davies hunched over his desk. The air was thick with the smell of damp wool and the faint, metallic tang of anxiety. He ran a hand through his already disheveled hair, his eyes scanning the fragmented reports spread before him. They were contradictory, incomplete, a frustrating mosaic of whispers and shadows. The Ardennes, that sleepy, forgotten corner of the front, was suddenly buzzing with an unsettling energy. Unconfirmed sightings of heavy armor, unusual troop concentrations, a surge in fuel requisitions that defied logical explanation for a quiet sector. "It doesn't add up," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. The prevailing wisdom among the higher echelons was that the Germans were on the defensive, bleeding from 1,000 cuts, incapable of mounting anything more than localized skirmishes. The winter, they argued, made any large-scale offensive through the Ardennes an impossibility. Impassable roads, choked with snow, would cripple any mechanized advance. But Davies saw something else. He saw the deliberate misdirection, the feints, the carefully curated lack of concrete intelligence. It was too quiet. The very silence screamed of preparation. He'd spent sleepless nights piecing together the scraps, intercepted radio chatter that hinted at a massive undertaking, the unusual dispersal of German air assets, a chilling report about a large number of SS units being moved to the front. It all pointed to one thing, a massive, audacious offensive. He looked up as the door creaked open, admitting Major General Arthur Van Cleef. The general, despite the chill that seemed to seep into every corner of the building, radiated a certain robust, almost jovial presence. Yet beneath the surface, Davies knew, lay a shrewd and decisive mind. Van Cleef trusted Davies's instincts, a rare commodity in the often bureaucratic world of military intelligence. "Still wrestling with the ghosts, Captain?" Van Cleef asked, his voice a low rumble. He walked over to the desk, his eyes taking in the scattered papers. Davies gestured to the reports. "General, I'm telling you, something is brewing. The Germans are massing forces in the Ardennes. It's not a feint. It's not a diversion. It's the real thing. They're planning a major offensive, masked by this blizzard." Van Cleef picked up a report, his brow furrowed. "But the terrain, Davies, and the weather, it's suicidal. Our intelligence suggests they're depleted, on the ropes." "That's precisely what they want us to believe, sir," Davies countered, his voice tight with urgency. "They're using the snow as cover, blinding our air power. They're gambling on surprise, on our complacency. They're calling it Wacht am Rhein, Rhine Watch." The name, gleaned from a fragmented transmission, had lodged itself in his mind like a splinter. Van Cleef studied Davies, his eyes sharp and appraising. He'd seen the captain's meticulous work before, his uncanny ability to sift through noise and find the signal. He'd authorized Davies's unusual requests for increased surveillance in the Ardennes, requests that had been met with skepticism by others. "Rhine Watch," he mused. A rather ambitious name for a desperate gamble. He tapped a finger on the map near the Luxembourg border. If they are indeed planning to drive through here, it would be a significant push. Antwerp would be their objective. "Exactly, sir," Davies confirmed, leaning forward. "If they reach Antwerp, they split the Allied forces. They sever our supply lines. It could cripple the entire Western Front." He looked directly at Van Cleef, his gaze intense. "I need more resources, General. I need to get these warnings to the highest levels. We need to reinforce the Ardennes sector, redeploy units, prepare for a breakthrough. The fate of this war might hinge on what happens in the next 48 hours. Van Cleef remained silent for a long moment, the only sound the relentless drumming of the wind against the window panes. He saw the conviction in Davies's eyes, the desperate sincerity. He knew the risks of acting on incomplete intelligence, but he also knew the catastrophic consequences of ignoring a credible threat, especially one as potentially devastating as this. The joviality seemed to recede, replaced by a steely resolve. "All right, Captain," Van Cleef said, his voice firm. "You've convinced me. We'll push this up the chain. I'll make the calls. But you need to keep digging. Give me concrete proof, Davies. Give me something undeniable. The clock is ticking, and this storm, it's not just a weather event. It's a shroud, and I have a bad feeling about what's hiding beneath it." He clapped Davies on the shoulder, a gesture of solidarity mixed with the grim understanding of the task ahead. "Let's hope your Rhine Watch doesn't turn into a German nightmare. For their sake, and for ours." The wind howled a mournful dirge around the cramped intelligence office in Luxembourg, a sound that mirrored the gnawing unease in Captain Robert Davies's gut. Outside, the blizzard raged, a monochrome nightmare that had transformed the Ardennes into a frozen, impassable wilderness. Inside, the air was thick with the acrid scent of stale cigarette smoke and the metallic tang of anxiety. Davies stared at the map spread across his desk, his face a road map of sleepless nights, the flickering lamplight casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to mock his efforts. He'd presented his case to Van Cleef, laying out the fragmented pieces of intelligence like a desperate puzzle solver. The unusual troop concentrations, the furtive movements of fuel convoys, the sudden silence from certain reconnaissance outposts. It all pointed to something far grander, far more audacious than a mere tactical feint. The prevailing wisdom among the Allied command was that Germany was a spent force, its offensives reduced to desperate, suicidal gambits. But Davies, with his obsessive attention to detail, his uncanny ability to sift through the noise and find the signal, couldn't shake the feeling that they were staring into the abyss, utterly blind. Van Cleef, a man whose joviality often masked a shrewd, strategic mind, had listened with a furrowed brow. He'd seen Davies's brilliance before, had gambled on his instincts, and so far, it had paid dividends. But this was a leap of faith, an offensive through the Ardennes, a sector deemed too heavily forested and too lightly defended to be a viable axis of advance, especially in this weather. It defied logic. Yet Davies's conviction was a palpable force, a steady, unyielding pressure against the tide of complacency. Van Cleef had promised to push the intelligence up, to make the generals listen, but he'd also tasked Davies with finding the smoking gun, the irrefutable proof that would shatter the illusion of peace. Now Davies was back at it, his fingers tracing the sparse lines of the German front. He'd been poring over intercepted radio communications, the garbled, fragmented messages a maddening riddle. Most were mundane, operational chatter, but a few keywords, a peculiar cadence, a shift in the usual pattern of communication. These were the breadcrumbs he followed. He felt like a lone prospector panning for gold in a raging blizzard, sifting through mountains of snow for a single, precious nugget. He leaned closer, his breath misting on the cold glass of the map case. There it was again, a series of coded messages originating from a sector manned by the 6th Panzer Army. They spoke of special preparations, unforeseen delays, and a final blessing from the weather. The last phrase sent a shiver down his spine. "Frolic of the winter gods," one message cryptically referred to it. It was too poetic, too deliberate for standard military jargon. It hinted at something that embraced the storm, that used it as a cloak. He cross-referenced these transmissions with reconnaissance reports. A lull in aerial activity, an unusual concentration of armored vehicles spotted on secondary roads, a significant increase in fuel deliveries. All these details, when viewed through the lens of his growing suspicion, began to coalesce into a terrifying picture. It wasn't just a large-scale raid. It was an offensive, a Blitzkrieg, a desperate gamble by a dying regime. And it was scheduled to begin not in days, but in hours. The sheer audacity of it was breathtaking. The Ardennes, a quiet sector, a training ground for new troops, a place where Allied soldiers expected a quiet Christmas. The Germans, crippled by fuel shortages and Allied air superiority, were planning to pour their remaining armored might through this seemingly impregnable forest, hoping to catch the Allies completely off guard. The blizzard, which had grounded Allied aircraft and made ground transportation a nightmare, was not an impediment. It was their ally, their camouflage, their intoxicating war-winning advantage. Davies's mind raced. He needed more. He needed something that would make Van Cleef, and more importantly, the higher-ups, understand the magnitude of the threat. He needed to pinpoint the exact location, the precise timing, the intended thrust. He pulled out another stack of reports, his eyes scanning for any mention of specific units, any unusual troop movements near the Siegfried Line. Meanwhile, miles away, deep within the Ardennes, Colonel Hans Dietrich surveyed the desolate landscape from the mouth of his makeshift command bunker. The wind whipped snow into a frenzy, obscuring the skeletal trees and reducing visibility to mere yards. The air was frigid, biting at his exposed skin, a raw, elemental force that seemed to mirror the desperation coiled within him. "The Führer is enthusiastic, Colonel," Major Klaus Richter rasped, his voice thin against the gale. He held out a sheaf of papers, his gloved fingers fumbling with the cold. He believes this is it, the decisive blow that will shatter the enemy's will. Dietrich took the papers, his gaze sweeping over the flowery rhetoric, the fervent pronouncements of victory. He knew the Führer's pronouncements well. They were intoxicating, a potent elixir for men on the brink, but often divorced from the harsh, brutal reality of the front. He looked at Richter, whose face was a mask of weariness, his eyes hollowed by the relentless strain of command and the gnawing doubt that had become a constant companion. "Enthusiastic," Dietrich repeated, a dry, humorless sound. "Let us hope his enthusiasm is matched by the capabilities of our men and machines." He gestured with his chin towards the swirling snow. "This storm, it is both our shield and our greatest adversary, Klaus. It conceals our movements, yes, but it also cripples our reconnaissance, blinds our air power, and turns every road into a treacherous quagmire." "The panzer divisions are ready, Colonel," Richter said, his voice regaining a sliver of its usual steel. "The fuel has been acquired. The men are motivated." He hesitated, the unspoken "but" hanging heavy in the air. Dietrich knew the buts. The buts were the worn-out tanks, the depleted ammunition stores, the ragged uniforms that offered little protection against this brutal winter. The buts were the young men, barely out of their teens, their faces etched with fear and uncertainty, about to be thrown into the maw of an enemy that, despite its own struggles, still possessed overwhelming material. "The 6th Panzer Army is positioned on the northern flank," Dietrich said, his voice low and measured. "Their spearhead will punch through here, aiming for the Meuse. If they can cross, if they can break the Allied lines before they can react, then the momentum might carry us. It is a desperate plan, Klaus, but desperation is all we have left." He crumpled the Führer's orders in his fist. "Tell the men that their courage, their sacrifice, will be remembered. Tell them that this is for Germany." He didn't add that he hoped they would live to see the dawn. Richter nodded, a somber understanding passing between the two officers. They were caught in the gears of a colossal machine, driven by a desperate will to survive, a will that was rapidly being ground down by the relentless pressure of the war. Back in Luxembourg, Davies felt a surge of adrenaline. He'd found it. A fragmented, heavily encrypted message, intercepted just hours ago, mentioning the specific designation of an armored division, a division known to be held in reserve on the Western Front. Its deployment to the Ardennes sector, coupled with the other intel, was the undeniable proof. It was suicidal. It was audacious. It was precisely the kind of desperate gamble a cornered regime would take. He grabbed the message, along with the supporting reports, and bolted for Van Cleef's office. The blizzard outside seemed to intensify, as if the very elements were conspiring to obscure the truth. But Davies was no longer just a solitary intelligence officer sifting through scraps. He was a man who had seen the storm coming, and he was determined to make them believe him before the tempest broke. He had the proof, and now he had to make them listen. The fate of tens of thousands, perhaps the fate of the war itself, rested on his ability to break through the wall of complacency before the first German tank rolled through the snow-laden trees. The encrypted message, a stark white rectangle against the drab confines of Davies's office, felt like a shard of ice in his hand. Major General Van Cleef's gaze, usually a blend of joviality and shrewd assessment, was now fixed, etched with a dawning seriousness. He'd seen the decrypted contents, the mention of the 12th SS Panzer Division, a unit known for its ferocity. It was the keystone Davies had been searching for, the irrefutable proof that the Ardennes, that frozen backwater, was indeed the intended target of Germany's final, desperate gamble. "The 12th SS," Van Cleef murmured. The words rasped, as if the very mention of the elite panzer division scraped against his throat. "They're not exactly the sort of troops you stage a feint with, Davies." He looked up, his eyes meeting Davies's across the cluttered desk. "This is significant. More than significant. This is a goddamn thunderclap." Davies nodded, the tension in his shoulders coiling tighter. "The timing, General. The blizzard is key. They're banking on it, grounding our air power, blinding us. They want to hit us when we're at our most vulnerable, when the weather makes us feel invincible in our complacency." He gestured to the scattered maps, the reports, the fragmented pieces of intelligence that had coalesced into this terrifying mosaic. "They've assembled a force that belies their current strategic position. It's not a desperate last stand. It's an audacious thrust, designed to decapitate our salient, to shatter our lines, and sever our supply routes all the way to Antwerp." Van Cleef leaned back, the worn leather of his chair groaning in protest. His fingers, usually drumming a cheerful rhythm, were still. He was calculating. The implications were staggering. A successful thrust through the Ardennes wouldn't just mean a tactical setback. It could fundamentally alter the course of the war, pushing the Allies back, prolonging the conflict, and costing countless more lives. The arrogance of it, the sheer audacity, was almost breathtaking. "Antwerp," Van Cleef mused, the word hanging heavy in the frigid air. "That's a long way, Davies. A very long way through some of the roughest terrain in Europe, even without a blizzard." He tapped a finger on the map, tracing a route through the dense, snow-laden forests. "The roads will be treacherous. The forests will swallow them whole. And the winter. It's a brutal mistress out there." "They know that, sir," Davies said, his voice low and urgent. "And they're counting on our underestimation. They're counting on us believing it's impossible. They've prepared for it, disguised their movements, used the weather as their shield. They've rolled the dice, General, and they've put everything on it." Van Cleef rose, pacing the narrow confines of his office. The flickering lamplight cast long, dancing shadows that seemed to mirror the uncertainty hanging over them. He stopped at the window, gazing out at the monochrome landscape, the relentless snow still swirling like a vengeful spirit. "I've seen generals throw away armies on less, but I've also seen intelligence officers stake their careers on hunches that turned out to be the keys to victory." He turned back to Davies, his expression resolute. "This warning needs to go to Eisenhower's headquarters immediately, and it needs to be clear, unequivocal, and backed by everything you've got." "I'll draft the report, sir. I'll include every scrap of corroborating evidence, every coded phrase, every troop movement we've tracked," Davies assured him, already reaching for a fresh pad of paper, his mind racing ahead, cataloging the details, the patterns, the whispers of impending doom. Meanwhile, miles away, on the German side of the front, the air in Colonel Hans Dietrich's makeshift command bunker was thick with the acrid scent of stale cigar smoke and a nervous energy that crackled like static electricity. Outside, the Ardennes Forest was a skeletal, monochrome nightmare, the relentless snow muffling all sound save for the gnawing howl of the wind. Dietrich, his face a road map of sleepless nights, studied the maps spread across a rough wooden table. The lines of Wacht am Rhein were meticulously drawn, a bold, almost arrogant thrust into the heart of the Allied defenses. Major Klaus Richter, his uniform dusted with a fine layer of snow that seemed to have infiltrated even this subterranean refuge, stood beside him, his expression a mirror of Dietrich's own weariness. He'd just returned from a reconnaissance mission, the biting wind having whipped at his face like a phantom claw. "The men are ready, Colonel," Richter reported, his voice rasped by the cold and fatigue. "Morale is as high as it can be under the circumstances. They understand the stakes. They understand what we're fighting for." He hesitated, then added, "But the weather, Colonel. It's unlike anything I've ever seen. The roads are already impassable in places. The tanks will struggle. And the air, the sky is a solid wall of white." Dietrich nodded, his gaze unwavering from the map. "That is our ally, Richter. The snow, the fog, the sheer, unadulterated surprise. They expect us to be bogged down, to be cautious. They believe this sector is a frozen backwater, too difficult for a major offensive. That is where we will strike." He tapped a point on the map, his finger tracing the intended path of the German advance. "Antwerp. We cut their supply lines, we split their forces, and we sow chaos. This is not a battle for territory. It is a battle for time, a chance to cripple them, to force them to reconsider, to give us a breathing space." "But the Führer's expectations, Colonel," Richter ventured, his voice barely above a whisper. "He believes this will be a decisive victory. He speaks of shattering the enemy, of turning the tide completely." Dietrich finally looked up from the map, his eyes, though tired, burning with a fierce, unyielding conviction. "The Führer has a vision, Richter. It is our duty to make it a reality. We have the tanks, we have the men, and we have the element of surprise. What more can we ask for?" He paused, a flicker of doubt, quickly suppressed, crossing his face. "The risks are enormous, I know. This is a desperate gamble. But what other options do we have? We are bleeding. We are outnumbered. This is our last chance to strike a blow that matters." He picked up a field telephone, its backlight casing cold to the touch. "I need to speak with General von Manteuffel. We need to confirm the final timings. Every hour counts. Every minute is precious." As he began to dial, the rhythmic drumming of his fingers against the receiver was the only sound in the bunker. A stark counterpoint to the tempest raging outside, a tempest that would soon unleash not only the fury of war, but the brutal, unyielding power of winter itself. Back in Luxembourg, Captain Robert Davies watched as Major General Van Cleef's aide, a young lieutenant with a face still too smooth for the grim realities of war, hurried out of the office, a sealed envelope clutched in his gloved hand. The report, Davies's meticulously crafted warning, was on its way to the highest echelons of Allied command. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the fate of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands, now rested on whether those in power could see past their assumptions, past the impassive, snow-laden landscape, to the true, devastating threat lurking within the Ardennes. He leaned back in his chair, the worn leather creaking a familiar lament. The office felt colder now, the silence more profound. He'd done all he could. He'd seen the pattern, deciphered the whispers, and presented the evidence. Now, it was a waiting game. A game played out against the backdrop of a brutal winter, a desperate offensive, and the unwavering belief of a single intelligence officer that the storm was coming, and it was far worse than anyone imagined. He closed his eyes for a moment, picturing the German tanks, hidden in the snow-laden forests, poised to unleash their fury. The metallic tang of fear, sharp and distinct, filled his mouth. The Wacht am Rhein was about to begin. The blizzard raged, a monochrome nightmare made real. For Colonel Hans Dietrich, it was the breath of a vengeful god, a divine cloak for his audacious gamble. He stood in the cramped, acrid air of the forward command bunker, the flickering light of a single bare bulb casting dancing shadows on the faces of his officers. Outside, the wind howled like a famished wolf, its icy breath finding every crack, every seam, a constant gnawing reminder of the brutal theater they were about to enter. "This snow," Major Klaus Richter rasped, his voice rough from a persistent cough. "It's a blessing, Herr Oberst. The Führer was right. The Americans will never expect it." He gestured vaguely towards a crude map pinned to the damp earth wall, a tangle of lines denoting roads, rivers, and the heavily forested Ardennes. Dietrich nodded, his gaze fixed on the Ardennes. It was a frozen backwater, a sector deemed impassable by the Allied command, a place where their defenses were thinnest. Their vigilance lulled by the deceptive quiet. They have grown complacent, Klaus. They see this forest, this weather, and they see an insurmountable obstacle. We will show them it is merely an inconvenient path. He ran a gloved hand over his stubbled chin, the rough wool scratching his skin. The weight of command pressed down on him, a physical ache in his bones, as real as the chill that seeped through his uniform. This was not just another battle. This was Wacht am Rhein, the Rhine Watch, a desperate lunge at the heart of the Allied advance, a final fevered attempt to shatter their unity, to force them back, to buy Germany precious time. "The fuel," Richter said, his tone a low murmur, laced with a weariness that spoke of too many sleepless nights and too little to eat. "We have enough for the initial push, but to sustain it, that is the question." "We will take it from them," Dietrich stated, his voice firm, though a sliver of doubt, sharp and cold, pricked at the edges of his resolve. "Antwerp, that is the prize, their lifeline. Cut it, and their armies wither." He looked at Richter, meeting his weary gaze. "We have the tanks, the men. They are eager. They understand what is at stake." Richter offered a thin, humorless smile. "Eager, Herr Oberst? Or simply resigned? They know the odds. They know what this means for us, for Germany, if it fails." Dietrich turned away, his gaze sweeping across the faces of the young officers gathered around the table, their expressions a mixture of grim determination and an unspoken fear. He saw his own anxieties reflected there, magnified. "Failure is not an option, Klaus. The Führer has placed his faith in this. The fatherland bleeds. This offensive, it is our last hope." He paused, then added, his voice softer. "We give them the element of surprise, the snow, the darkness. That is our advantage. We must strike with the ferocity of a cornered beast." Outside, the wind shrieked, a mournful dirge for the coming storm. The blizzard was more than just weather. It was a strategic weapon, a monstrous ally that would blind their air power, muffle their communications, and sow confusion. It was the frolic of the winter gods, as some cryptic intercepts had alluded, a phrase that now echoed with a chilling prescience. In Luxembourg, the air in Captain Robert Davies's cramped office was thick with the smell of stale coffee and the metallic tang of anxiety. The single overhead lamp cast a harsh glare on the piles of intelligence reports, each one a fragmented piece of a vast, terrifying puzzle. The blizzard outside was a muffled roar, a distant threat that had, until now, been little more than an inconvenience, a nuisance to be endured. Davies stared at the map spread across his desk, his finger tracing the Ardennes. It was a ghost sector, a forgotten corner of the front line. His superiors, including the genial but shrewd Major General Arthur Van Cleef, had initially dismissed his growing unease. "A German offensive? Through there? In this weather, Davies? They'd be bogged down before they even crossed the hour," Van Cleef had said with a hearty laugh, his face a roadmap of jovial skepticism. But Davies had a mind that thrived on contradictions, on the whispers of the improbable. The increased fuel requisitions, the unusual troop movements, the sudden silencing of certain radio frequencies. They were all discordant notes in the symphony of expected operations. He had spent days sifting through fragmented intercepts, piecing together a narrative that defied logic. And then he'd found it, a coded message, a single sentence that